my grandmother took the whole family to be at the pier when the Frierdiker Rebbe arrived in America. Tess Udder in March of 1940. They were there for hours. And what were they doing? They were singing nigunim. Huh. And my mother said it was the first time in her life that she heard these nigunim someplace that was not her parents' table. And that was when she incorporated the idea that you can be part of a community even when you're not geographically together.
Welcome to Homesick for Lubavitch, a podcast where we explore Lubavitch identity in the year 2024. My name is Bentzi, and I will be your host. Let's begin. Alrighty, we are here. I am here with Mrs. Deren, Mrs. Vivi Deren, Stamford, Connecticut. Because I like to make everything about myself, I usually like to remember how I first met or encountered the person on the podcast. I think in this case, I met your children at some stage of my life. Over different stages of my life. Ashi, of course, was my head counselor at some point, as he was for thousands of others. I think he was my head counselor at the shluchim camp, the Tenessee shluchim. Anyway, I know
you did that.
Yes, I know Chezi from camp. Yossi's related to me. I know Mendy. Mm-hmm. So yes, and of course, I heard many stories in camp from your husband, Rabbi Yisrael Deren. So that is the background. But this is the first time I'm meeting you, which is a great honor and pleasure. Thank you very much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for inviting me.
And I must give a shout out at the beginning to my very dear friend Mendy Wolf, who is your nephew.
My nephew. Yeah.
And the shadchan of this episode. So whatever happens, it's on you, Mendy. I have no concerns. So anyway, there is a topic that we wanted to get to, which is in many ways about the generations of Lubavitch, the common denominators, the differences, the distances, the generation gaps, and how the Rebbe comes into all of that. And we will get back to it. But I figured let's first start with a little bit of a background, who you are. I know very often that starts with your parents. That's what happens when you have a larger-than-life father, but yeah.
Okay, I happen to be very fond of family history and genealogy and just figuring out who's related to who, certainly in my own family, but not just in my own family. But I'll start with that. And if I start going too far afield, you can please feel free to bring it back to where you want to focus. I was born in Nashville, Tennessee. My parents were sent there by the Frierdiker Rebbe, by the previous Rebbe. My father came in Elul. They were engaged, Elul of Tavshin Tes, 1949. They got married.
Who are your parents, for those who don't know?
Who are my parents?
Just their names.
Okay.
Just their names.
Yeah. Okay, so my father was Rabbi Zalman Posner. My mother's name was Rissia, but no, most people don't know that except now for the great-granddaughters that are named for her. She was known as Diddy. That was her nickname that stuck for her whole life, certainly in family and any Lubavitcher connection. So
Zalman and Diddy Posner.
Zalman and Diddy Posner. And my mother was a Kazanovsky. So Shlomo Aaron Kazanovsky and my bubby Freda were her parents.
Was your grandfather?
Yeah, he's my grandfather. And actually, I came to New York to go to school at the age of 10, which was I was basically homeschooled. My parents had started a day school when I was in kindergarten. I was the third class, and then we were away from Nashville for a year, so the school fell apart and had to be restarted. They didn't have a grade for me. At this point, I was in the middle of third grade. So for 2.5 years, I was homeschooled. Probably among the best educational years of my life. My father was my teacher for the Limudei Kodesh. We did not cover a lot of ground because he was running a school, he was running the shul, he was the rabbi of the community, he was translating so much of Chassidus, he translated 2 parts of Tanya and many other, which is a whole nother story. So time was very difficult, but the quality, I love learning Chumash till today because of how I learned with him. And I love learning because of how I learned with him. He taught me with questions. I had to figure out the pasuk. He said, you know this and you know this. So just even translating. But he made me think, and it came alive. It just came alive. When I learned Chumash with him, it was very current. It was very present. Just, I guess it was his own love of learning that just came through. So even though when I came to New York, I was ahead of myself in Limudei Chol. I had a tutor for that, so I was way ahead of where any class was. In Limudei Kodesh, I was a grade lower. In other words, at my regular grade level, I had a lot of catching up to do. And I came to New York then.
1 second. So it's very interesting. You're saying that you were behind in terms of ground covered, but
Quantity.
but ahead in quality.
I feel like I was. I'm sure. I know that I missed out on a lot of things. Other than that, I think other than the things that I was learning and loving to learn.
Right.
But there were a lot of things that we didn't cover. So some of it I was able to make up during my years in Beis Rivka, and some of it I still have gaps, that I'm trying to cover. But not just from that. It was just there was a limited amount of time that we could actually learn. But it was such a positive experience.
Right.
And it made me feel very anxious to learn more. I also felt very capable and competent because of the way he drew me into it. Coming to New York, in those years, Beis Rivka was, many of the teachers only spoke Yiddish. I did not speak Yiddish at all. So it worked out for me that I had teachers who spoke in English and translated into Yiddish, but that was a whole another challenge. But my parents did not have any thought of sending me away. They just, things were going along fine. I was like 9.5, a little bit more, Pesach time. My birthday's in the summer, Pesach time of that year. My father had Yechidus, and the Rebbe asked him what's happening with my schooling. And my father was shocked. He had nothing to answer. They had no thought of, this is not a long-term plan for me to just sit at home. I mean, I would be part of, he had a class for bar mitzvah boys that they learned Gemara, so I was in that class, or he had, I knew everybody's haftarah. I knew a little bit of, they were learning Hamafkid. It did not excite me at the time. So, but
how about today?
It doesn't. I'm thrilled that my granddaughter is studying in the Bat Sheva Learning Institute in Brooklyn. And she mentioned something about a halacha shir. I said, do you learn Gemara? And she said, yes, of course. And I was like, wow. And I think that's a piece, as there are, I believe, many, many, many such pieces of things where the Rebbe gave an indication of something that should happen. And we didn't always pick it up. And sometimes things would be picked up in a way of, well, but the Rebbe didn't mean this, or the Rebbe, whatever it was. But I think women learning Gemara in a competent way, in a way that they can own what they're learning. I think this was 1990 when the Rebbe said this. This, I think, was in May. I think it was this month. But whatever. But this idea of women learning primary source, learning halacha, starting all the way back with Gemara, it's an incredible way to teach. And we should be incorporating that. So I'm Baruch Hashem, a great grandmother. I'm trying to stay on top of what I'm learning and to try and learn new things. And I believe that that's the fountain of youth, is if you can keep learning new things. So maybe I don't want to close off Gemara, but at this point, I'm glad that my granddaughter is doing it,
Fair answer.
or
So,
granddaughters.
Homesick for Lubavitch is brought to you by Yuvla Media, which, yes, is my video production company. At Yuvla Media, we believe in the same principles as this podcast, namely that in our communities there are just so many stories worth sharing and worth telling, and that in the end, a good story is always so much more. Over the past few years, we have helped dozens of nonprofits, companies, and families share their very precious stories with the community. If you're looking to share your story, please don't hesitate to reach out to us for a free consultation at hello@yuvlamedia.com. Again, that's hello@yuvlamedia.com. A link can be found below as well. For now, let's get back to the podcast.
We're doing that.
So did I ever ask your father about the plans for you?
There were none. There were none. I think they were just going to keep on going,
Right.
at least for the foreseeable future. I wasn't even 10. And the Rebbe said that it was time for me to go away. And I should go someplace where I would not have to switch. In other words, I was in 5th, 6th grade then. I would not have to switch like for high school. I don't know if they ever spelled that out then. Which meant basically there were no Lubavitcher high schools anywhere. There were very few Lubavitcher elementary schools.
Right, this
So-
is before Beis Rivka High School, right?
This was, there was only Beis Rivka High School. There was the high school, but I'm saying there was only New York.
Right.
There were some other Canada, but that was not even on the table.
Right.
And interestingly, my grandparents lived in Bensonhurst. They lived in America from 1926, 27. They came to America around that time. And my grandfather had 2 shuls in Bensonhurst. In 1940, when the Frierdiker Rebbe came, my grandfather was very instrumental. He was very much a part of, back in 1927, after he had just come here, and trying to imagine how there were a few chassidim, how much English did they speak? What did they know? And they were traveling to Washington to get the Frierdiker Rebbe's sentence commuted, to get him out of prison. How did they, like the breitkeit, the confidence, the commitment to be able to do something like that. But in any case, in 1940, when the Frierdiker Rebbe came and stayed in America, he was very instrumental then in, he led the negotiations for the purchase of 770 and so on. But moving to Crown Heights was never on the table. The Rebbe wanted him to stay, first the Frierdiker Rebbe and then our Rebbe, to stay in Bensonhurst. Bensonhurst from Crown Heights is on 3 city buses. It's an hour traveling. Beis Rivka at that time was on the other side of the moon. It was in Brownsville, which was 3 city buses and further, an hour and a quarter, an hour and 20 minutes. Bensonhurst is right next to Borough Park. Borough Park has Beis Yaakov. Beis Yaakov was putting up a new building. I would have a school bus that would pick me up and bring me home, door to door. And the Rebbe said that I should decide. And we visited Beis Yaakov, and I was not happy. I couldn't put my finger on it too much, but I didn't feel good about it. And then we went to Beis Rivka. And I remember being greeted by a name that people just don't know today, Rabbi Golden, Itche Golden, who was from my grandfather's generation. In 1920-21, he was a bacher in Rostov. He was basically, when the Frierdiker Rebbe was very, very ill, he was the bacher who was like taking care. And he was running the Beis Rivka plant. And he came out to greet us in the hall carrying a can of Ajax, cleaning something from this big washroom in one hand, and with a big Shalom Aleichem for my father, and just this warm welcome that just enveloped us the minute we walked into the building. And Rabbi Majeski Elva Shalom was the principal, and he was very very warm about me coming in. In Beis Yaakov, they had talked about that for sure I would have to go down 2 levels to 4th grade, and it just made me feel like, squashed tomato. And Rabbi Majeski was, till Hanukkah you'll be in the 5th grade, and then we'll see. But just very, it's going to be fine. We're going to work this out. And so I felt good about that. But it was also the first time in my life that I was in a place that was not connected to my family, but I saw the Rebbe's picture on the wall. So I knew I was at home. And I'm going to go to Beis Rivka. I'm going to go to this school. And I did. Baruch Hashem, my grandmother for a month came with me every single day on the 3 city buses.
Wow.
Until she was confident that I knew my way. And there was a little bit of an easy arrangement to get home. At least I had a school bus part of the way. And I didn't go up Hanukkah time. I stayed in the lower class for 3 years, 5th, 6th, and 7th in Hebrew, which was the perfect teaching arrangement for me. And then in 9th grade, I joined. And that year I worked really, really hard. And at the end of the year, I had a very good, Baruch Hashem, a very, very good report card. And I wrote to the Rebbe thanking the Rebbe for Beis Rivka. And that what I loved the most was that the teachers were not just teaching subjects, they were teaching people that you feel like the teachers really care. They really care about you. And the Rebbe answered me, Tach tach al habsuras tevis, and with a bracha. So it was very personal.
How did you? I mean, there's so many things so many directions I could go from that. I would say concise history. But how did you see yourself in terms of coming from Nashville, Tennessee? I mean, this is something that obviously is a little bit more personal for me. Like in those days, you could probably count on your hand the amount of kids that were growing up.
None.
0. Okay, fine.
0.
It's like there was.
No, I mean, there were kids. I had friends, but there were no kids like me. In other words, there were no.
There were no other shluchim's kids?
In Nashville, Tennessee?
No. I'm talking about in Lubavitch. Nashville, I knew you're the only Lubavitcher.
We were the only Shemer Shabbos family.
Right. That part to me, to be honest, that's not so interesting to me. I mean, I grew up the same way. What's always more interesting to me is, yes, in Nashville, you're the only Lubavitcher. But in Lubavitch or in Karnitz, you're the only Nashville and whatever it's called. You're the only.
So it was
the only Southerner.
Yeah, it was very funny because I was definitely the first out of towner in the elementary school, and I think that same year, the first out of towner came to the high school. Happens to be we share great grandchildren. Devara Shmutkin, she was Goodman, and she came from New Haven to the high school. I think it was the same year, but out of town, Beis Rivka was very, very small. Out of towners were like, they didn't know what we were. There was in high school, I made a map.
Who's they? Yeah. The kids or the
teachers?
The kids.
The teachers we didn't discuss it really, so I don't know what they thought. So,
So sorry, you were making maps?
Yeah, so I made, for our high school newspaper, I made a map of the world the way my friends see the world. It was a big circle called New York. Around New York, there was a circle called Out of Town that had absolutely no relation to geography. In the circle around New York, there was Florida, maybe Chicago, but no connection of, like, they didn't, nobody went anywhere and nobody.
Right.
And then there was an ocean, and on the other side of the ocean, there was Russia, Eretz Yisrael, and Paris. And the reason why there was Paris, because my classmates either were born in Paris after their parents came from Russia after the war, or they were the first ones born in America. But Paris, everybody came from Paris. It was Russia, Paris to New York.
Yeah.
And so the sense of the world, I remember a girl asking me what language we speak in Tennessee. My mother was visiting. They saw her give me some change. You have the same money? You have the same money in Tennessee? And
Right.
you're so lucky you've been out of town. I've never been out of America except to go to the stupid old country. So the perception, it was a different world altogether. I found out years later that the New Yorker magazine had a magazine of how New Yorkers see the world, and it's New York is this big blob, and then then
Right.
there's the Hudson River and a few things on the other side. But that was, I mean, people didn't travel anywhere like what they do now. They're not even
Right.
people that I grew up with in Nashville. The average person had never been to New York ever.
Right.
So I was definitely a novelty.
You're a novelty. Did they see you? I mean, what you're talking about is simply provincialism, where like people grow up in in their own bubble.
Provincialism is a very New York characteristic, anyway.
Yes,
at least
exactly.
it was.
So that's why, to me, what's even more interesting is that they see you. They understand what this Lubavitch, or like, I'm talking from a more Lubavitch perspective,
Okay.
Lubavitch angle. Like, what's this Lubavitcher from Tennessee? Like, that doesn't fit. Like, was there any of that?
No, not really, because there
Or
was
shlichus? Did they understand?
there was an awareness of shlichus.
Okay.
None of the girls in the school at the time had were living on shlichus, but this is the early 60s. So there was something of an awareness, not a lot, but it was definitely something
I
that
see.
grew as the years went by. It became more and more. I think probably a factor why it was easy for them to see me as normal, shall we say, was people knew my grandparents on both sides.
Right.
Both of my grandfathers learned in Lubavitch. Both of them had close friendships that even if they didn't see their chaverim from, those years for another 30, 40, 50 years, it didn't matter. There was a closeness, there was a shared understanding. There was...
How about how you saw yourself? How did you fit right in? Oh, it's your house.
Yeah, I know, but it's your podcast.
It's your house. I'll cut it out.
I get cut out all the time.
I don't have to cut it out.
Your choice.
Nice to meet you. Nice to see you.
My honor.
All right. So, like you're mentioning that they understood where you were coming from, but did you feel like you fit in?
So, all right, I'm going to have to go back a little bit of a generation. My father was actually born in Eretz Yisrael, but my grandparents came to America when he was 3 years old. So he grew up in America.
Right. Just to point out,
Yeah.
for those who have listened to the podcast, your brother is the older brother. Your father is the older brother of Mrs. Gorelik.
Yeah.
So she
Those
spoke.
Zengizin, yeah.
Right. So she spoke a little bit about her older brother Zalman. That's
Yeah,
your father.
That's my father, yeah.
Yeah. If you want a little bit more of the family history,
Yeah.
you can go to that episode.
My mother grew up in New York her whole life. And New York, in those years, she grew up in Bensonhurst, which even though there was a large Jewish population, it was not a large frum population. And it was very much a given that the young people were not going to continue what the grandparents had done. Not because they were rebelling. I mean, I'm sure there was plenty of that also. But the sense that America is different. America is just, it's a different place. It's a different world. And yeah, there are all of these opportunities and so on. So for some of the older generation, there was a wistfulness that they felt bad that it wasn't going to be able to happen here. And for some, they were jumping headlong into these wonderful opportunities. And yeah, okay, so
By older generation, you mean your mother's
My
generation or your grandparents?
My grandparents' generation.
Right.
So my mother grew up with in a Jewish community that was very warmly and proudly Jewish, but kind of just accepting the fact that it's not happening here.
What's not happening? From
Yiddishkeit.
From Yiddishkeit?
Yiddishkeit,
or
yeah.
the way
from,
it used to?
From Yiddishkeit.
So they were expecting their kids to not be from.
Right. Or to be nominally from.
I see.
So a Seder for sure, even Friday night. But retail is retail, or, whatever it is. Right. And people would have opportunities. It was just either people were more enthusiastic about the great opportunities no matter the cost, right. Or they were, okay, the opportunities are great, and they're wistful about the cost. But it was like a given, there's a cost. Yiddishkeit is not happening here.
Right.
That's done.
And this is also chassidim, or you're talking about in general?
Among many chassidim, there was that.
Right.
There was that. I just, there was a point that I noticed in Der Herr magazine.
But 1 second. So
yeah.
I the Friedrich Rebbe said America is nicht anders.
When did he say that?
When did he say
that? When he came back, in 1940.
Right.
And there was a lot that had to happen to translate that into action.
No, my question was, it wasn't like today whenever you bring up that idea that America is different or that the generation is changing. People, but the Friedrich Rebbe said America is nicht anders. Was it not at that time, like you're saying that even chassidim had come to accept that things would change? Was it not? So they were not so adamant?
My mother's years of growing up, she was born in 1927, so in the 30s, when she was growing up, that idea, when my grandfather left Russia.
So you're saying this was before the Friedrich Rebbe said it?
Before he said that. Uh-huh. And that when he left Russia and he went to Rostov to, Zegen and Zach, to say goodbye to the Friedrich Rebbe before coming here.
Your grandfather?
Kazarnevsky, yeah, my mother's father.
Right.
So in that Yechidus, the Friedrich Rebbe said to him, "Wir wollen sich noch sehen. We will yet meet. We'll meet again." My grandfather told me that his immediate response was, "When soll ich kommen? When should I come?"
Right.
That it never crossed his mind. Now remember, this is 1926 or so. So this was before the arrest of the Friedrich Rebbe. It was before that whole passion. It was before the idea of a Rebbe coming to America. It didn't compute. It didn't even. It's not like people dismissed it. It didn't.
Right.
It didn't even come up.
Right.
So they're in America, and there's a lot of interesting things about the history, and there were those who fought very, very hard to maintain what they had, and they worked very hard to give their children a very positive connection, a very positive content. But the idea of living in a completely different world, that was a given. So why did I go into this whole thing? Because one of my mother's earliest memories, or strongest memories, says it was a day till the end of her life. She would talk about it as a day that she could remember from early in the morning until at night, every single detail. It was one of the most formative experiences of her life. My mother went with her whole family. My grandmother took the whole family to be at the pier when the Friedrich Rebbe arrived in America. Tes Adar in March of 1940. I think the boat docked in the afternoon, if I'm not mistaken. Whatever it was, he had the family up before dawn. They shouldn't be late. He was not taking any chances. And they were there for hours. And what were they doing? They were singing Nigunim. Huh. And my mother said it was the first time in her life that she heard these nigunim someplace that was not her parents' table. And that was when she incorporated the idea that you can be part of a community even when you're not geographically together. That community is not defined by geography. So she had this sense of community. She had this sense of belonging. She had this sense of my people. And yes, in a broad sense, you feel that with all Yidden, but that this connection of chassidim crystallized for her, and it stayed that way for her whole life. That she never wanted to live anywhere other than New York. She had no maybe to travel or whatever, but she was very happy living in New York. And when the Frierdiker Rebbe told my father to apply for this position that was referred to the Frierdiker Rebbe to be the rabbi of the Orthodox shul in Nashville, Tennessee, for the first number of years that my parents were there, people could not understand why a young rabbi would throw his life away to run a cemetery, because that was the function of Orthodox rabbis in those years.
Right.
What gave her the strength to be able to do it, how she could see herself, having grown up in Bensonhurst, which in some ways was out of town. In other words, it was not Crown Heights wasn't yet Crown Heights.
Heights wasn't Crown Heights.
But like they said, there was not a physical community,
Right.
but she knew that she belonged to a community.
Right. That's so fascinating. I was talking about it to your aunt. Although I think she had a different take on it, but yeah.
Well, she's a little bit later.
Yeah, no, but it is fascinating.
She grew up a little bit.
No, but it's fascinating the fact, like you just said, Crown Heights wasn't Crown Heights. Like the Lubavitchers in America at the time were on the outside, right?
For sure, there was a handful of people.
Right. No, but it wasn't even just geographic. It was like philosophically. Like America was, like you said, which to me is such a telling anecdote that your grandfather. It never occurred to him that the Frierdiker would ever it wasn't voluntary in the end, but would ever move to America. He visited in between.
And this was before that.
Right, but he visited, but even then he had the chance, I suppose, to settle down. No, I mean, this is basic history. The Frum Jews in Russia and Eastern Europe were vehemently opposed to moving to America because they felt that's where people go to assimilate. Not they felt, they knew.
So my father's father, and I don't know if my Aunt Bessie discussed this part, but my grandfather, Reb Shalom Posner,
right,
his grandfather came to America.
She didn't mention that, no.
His grandfather came to America. It was probably around the turn of the century. He had one son and several daughters. That son, who was known as Itche Zalman, I don't know if he was a bacher or if he was married and did not come with his family. He took one look at America and he said, I'm not going to be able to raise a frum family here. And he went back.
Maybe she did mention that. She did mention that you had other relatives who weren't religious.
Okay, so when they came, they were. So
Right.
Here was my great-great-grandfather with all these daughters.
He was a Lubavitcher chassid also?
I'm not sure. My grandfather's father was. And this Itche Zalman that my father was named for.
Itche Zalman was a
Lubavitcher
chassid, but you don't know if his parents, but they were from.
Right.
But
they were from. Yeah, they were from. They
from
were
Russia.
From Russia.
Russia.
And I don't know that much about them, but they were definitely from when they came here. Mm-hmm. And my grandfather had an aunt. She was one of the youngest, maybe the youngest. And we knew her. She passed away in 1987. We knew her. And she stayed very close to the family. And I remember once, talking to her, and she was describing, this was actually in a different conversation, describing what it was like to go to work on Shabbos when she had to. She thought she had to. She said that it was a sewing thing, and that the first week she was crying so hard that she couldn't handle the sewing machine because it was wet with tears. And the next week she didn't cry as much, etc. She says, and by the time she realized that she didn't have to work on Shabbos, and these were her words, that there was no Shabbos to come back to.
Wow.
So, and the children assimilated, which was, again, it wasn't a rebellion thing. It was basically considered inevitable.
Right.
My mother grew up before there was no Beis Yaakov yet.
Right.
She was in public school. She was tutored when she was like in high school. Rebbe Chadakov was her tutor, and that was how she could, obviously to read. She was taught before translation, some chumash and so on, but she was so fiercely proud of the education that I got and that my sisters got.
So you mentioned there, you mentioned a few times already, very interesting, this idea of community that's not tied to a specific locale. And it's already become a sort of running theme here where, you know, your grandfather has to bid farewell from Russia, but he's still connected to Lubavitch, even though he moves to America. And then your mother growing up and the realization when they're singing on the pier and that sense of identity with a group that perhaps was not manifest until that moment. So she hadn't seen it or seen what that looks like yet. And then you had mentioned earlier coming to Beis Rivka's school. What's that?
There's something else.
Yeah, go ahead. Sure.
I mentioned that my mother hadn't seen it except at her parents' table.
Right.
What did she see? Because the few chassidim who were in the New York area at that time, they would get together very regularly.
Ah, okay.
So she saw chassidim. And
Like who, for example?
Rabbi Jacobson, Rabbi Simpson, later Rabbi Shmuel, but I don't know if he wasn't there yet. But in the 30s, Rabbi Yochanan Gordon.
What were all of them doing there? They had opened sent specifically by the Frierdiker Rebbe to come to America, or some of them?
I don't know specifically of how they came here. Some were they were Rabbanim, some were Shachtim.
Your grandfather, Kazanowski, how did he end up in America?
My grandfather came when he came after, I think it was after 1923. To come to America, you had to be basically not just sponsored. You have to have a job waiting for you. So my grandfather had a half brother in Russia, in Rochester, who got his shul.
Half brother?
Yeah, in other words, they had the same. I'm not sure if it was on his mother's side or his father's side.
So one of his parents had emigrated to America, basically.
No, just I think the brother had come on his own.
I see. Another Russian-born.
A Russian-born sibling.
Who was Lubavitch or?
No.
No,
he came. No, his family was not Lubavitch.
No, but his half brother had grown up. Oh, your grandfather's family was not. He didn't come from a Lubavitch family.
I don't think so.
I see.
I don't think
So
so.
you had
but there was a connection with his mother that I know about. So I'm not sure about his father.
So he had a relative. He had a. Yeah, sorry to all the Kazanowskis if we're if we're dinking your yichus over here.
Oh, for sure. There's going to be
How
did you say this? How did you say that? I'm not so sure about them. I do know that his mother did have a strong connection, and I can tell you some stories with that, which actually involve your great-great-grandmother, something like that.
Which one? This is getting too in the weeds. I just want to make sure that we don't.
It's a good story.
I just want to make sure that I'm happy to hear it.
Okay,
so let's hear it.
Let me.
Which great grandmother?
The one that your mother is named for.
Oh, Esther Golda Shemtov, Futterfass.
When she was a little girl.
She was close with or she knew your.
No.
Okay.
No, actually, they.
So let's hear the story.
No, I conflated two stories.
I see.
I know a story with her, with Rebbe and Rivka, and a story with my great-grandmother and Rebbe and Rivka. So I was conflating the stories. So I don't think they actually knew each other.
The story about marrying a bacher when she grows up?
Yeah.
Yeah, we said my great aunt told it on the podcast.
Yeah, she told it to me.
Yeah, it's a beautiful story.
She told it to me. And why she told it to me is an interesting thing. Okay, so coming back to this. So yes, my great-grandmother also had this connection. And in my mind, I kind of just melded them, but no, they're not connected. As far as I know.
So I just want to make clear, we're not ungezhing any Kazanowskis here. If they think they're gej, we are not undoing any of that.
We can come back to gej in a minute, because I just read a very, very interesting thing from the Frierdiker Rebbe about that. Okay. He speaks about 3 types of chassidim. They're the chassidim who are it's almost like levels of connection. The top level is through learning chassidus.
Right.
The next level is chassidim of nusach.
Okay.
And the next level is chassidim of gezha. In other words, it's nothing to do with their life. It's just that they happen to be descendants, that they are descendants of people who were chassidim, but it doesn't say anything about them.
Well, now we've gotten everybody angry.
That's just fine. It's just fine.
Okay, so you were saying that your parents would have these chassidim over
My grandparents.
Your grandparents would have these chassidim
Right.
over, and that's your mother grew up seeing these chassidim
Yes.
come together,
Yes.
but she hadn't ever seen it take place publicly in a
Right.
public space.
Right.
Until
And certainly not with numbers. Until March 1940, she was 13 years old, and the Friedrich Rebbe came to America.
And that's almost, it sounds like that's when the community of Lubavitch was finally ready to go public. Like,
Well, it was the numbers were growing,
right.
but I want to come back to the 30s for a little bit, to
Okay,
the part
sure.
that I can recognize and to trace a little bit, because they were not just sentimental people who were, remember the good old days, remember, what it was like in Lubavitch, remember in yeshiva, remember Farbrengens by the Rebbe and this mashpeh and that. They weren't just remembering. They had I don't know that Chabad totally cornered the market on it and that it's only in Chabad. I'm not going to go so far, but definitely an inherent, intrinsic part of being a Lubavitcher. And that was a chassid macht asviva. You create your environment. You create your environment. It is a very empowering idea. There's a lot of responsibility there, but it's also gives you a sense of what you can do, a sense of purpose, a sense of mission. So one of the things that I've said this many times, and I feel it more and more in life, my parents never were apologetic to us about our life. We don't. Never even occurred to me to, I knew once when in my earlier years, I didn't even see cousins once a year. Later, it was, that much. But it didn't occur to me to feel bad that we were being deprived, that there were no other Shemesh Shabbos kids, that we didn't get to see our cousins. Oh, it's so hard. I never had got a whiff of that from my parents. The sense that I had was they loved life. They loved us. They loved what they were doing. They were happy. They were happy. And neither one of them was the rah-rah, let's sing songs kind. Although my mother loved Nagunim especially. But it wasn't a personality trait. It was a character trait. That I'm where I'm supposed to be, and I like it here.
In Nashville.
Yeah.
They were very positive about it.
Very positive about it. And people would always ask my mother, and then I found out later, people would always ask me, where do you like it better? You like it better in Nashville? And my answer was always, I don't even compare them. They're just so completely different. I loved being in Nashville when I was there. I loved being in New York when I was there. But that was for me as a kid, as a 10-year-old. But for my mother, she didn't give up, her sense of what she missed. Although she once told the only physical thing that she really, really missed was being near the ocean.
Bensonhurst.
No, and being in Nashville. Nashville is landlocked.
I'm saying she missed.
From
her growing up in Bensonhurst.
Right, in New York.
Right, because Crown Heights isn't near the ocean, but Bensonhurst is closer,
right?
Right,
That's true. But
right. We're just going back.
We're
just going back to the circles, because if you grow up in Crown Heights, now the circle is Crown Heights, and all of Brooklyn is outside that circle.
Yeah, but people move now. People move around, so it's different.
Fair.
No, but that sense of, so we had a normal, happy childhood of. My parents were not the entertainment bureau. They were not constantly planning. I mean, there were things that we did as a family. I'm not going to say that didn't happen, but we figured a lot of things out for ourselves, which was, I think, very typical of that time in America, that adults did not see their role as having to provide entertainment. And so it was not, well, what are we going to do? It just didn't work like that. Not that we never did things, but it wasn't like, your job is to entertain me, make sure that I'm not bored.
Right.
Anyway, but the main point that I wanted to bring.
Where do you think Lubavitchers got that from? Because it's a very important part of Lubavitch identity. This idea that it's almost like Lubavitchers or Lubavitch in general was never. Like, I think there's a few ways of looking at it. Lubavitch was never dependent on being part of a community. Yes, I know, because I've already been chastised. You know, your grandfather grew up in, my great grandfather grew up in Neville. There's a community in Neville. I know there were communities. But by and large, Lubavitchers, you see in the Filikars Yeshivas also, they were scattered. A lot of the Rebbeim sent Lubavitchers, or the early Rebbeim sent Lubavitchers to run these taverns and inns in the boondocks, you know. So there's at the very least there's this sense that Lubavitch isn't dependent on a community, and like you said, like chassid macht es sviva. But then it begins to feel almost like Lubavitchers, or like community is almost antithetical to Lubavitch. Like the idea.
Okay, so
So where do you think that comes from?
I think the value is a very basic value. Sorry, the value is a very basic value. When we were kids,
I can also move the microphone
one
back.
of the what? That's fine. One of the teachers in the school, there was an Israeli Mizrahi affiliation who was getting his doctorate. In fact, his story is Moshe Mandelbaum. His story is in the My Story, one of the books of my father connected him to the Rebbe. And his wife taught in the day school, and he taught on Sundays, because there was also, you know, what my father would call the Sunday cheder, but it was, you know, Sunday school. And the Sunday kids were mostly public school kids, and his wife taught in the day school. In any case, he told my father that he was teaching my brother's class about, I guess it was Parsha or something, you know, Bereshis. And my brother said to him, was Avram Avinu Lubavitch? He loved the question, and he got it right away. You know, Echad Hay Avram.
Right.
You know, and that's
that part.
that part.
I thought you were talking about the like getting people to make a bracha. But Echad Hay Avram.
Echad Hay Avram. I mean, there's probably a whole bunch of things there, but he got, you know, why would a kid? Because that's a big piece of it, the hospitality piece, and as a way, you know, bring them into Chabad house, and then they're gonna. That's the way to get the Yiddishkeit. But remember that he started out doing this, the only one in the world. He had nobody to learn from, nobody to show him, nobody to guide him. So I mean, Baruch Hashem, since he blazed the trail, but, you know, we don't have to invent ourselves in that same way. But this example of being the one. So I remember one time, this was in the 60s. By the way, what the teacher answered him, he says, oh, that's a very, very good question. You're going to have to ask Hamara Sara, his wife, teaching the class during the weeks. He said, so I gave her the job of answering it. But anyway, it was Avram Avinu Lubavitch. So as a teenager in the mid-60s, when things were starting to go a little bit haywire in terms of it was before the student activism stuff, but in terms of fashions for women were becoming not so edel, shall we say, mid-60s. And I was in my father's office, and a young woman was interviewing him for her school project or something. And he was talking about having the, you know, the strength to be different, not to be afraid to be different. And so she was, you know, challenging him with that. Well, what happens if the whole world agrees with you? Then how are you going to be different? And so what happens to your value of being different? If you persuade if you're successful, isn't that going to be, you know, the failure of your idea? So he asked her, what is the opposite of a conformist? And she said, a nonconformist. And he said, no. A conformist looks at society and copies. A nonconformist does exactly the same thing, looks at society and does something else.
Right.
But they're both doing the same thing. It's not the opposite. It's two sides of one coin. Look at what everybody else is doing.
Right.
So what's the opposite? So he said the opposite of a conformist is a person of principle. I'm going to do the right thing. If I'm the only one in the world doing the right thing, so I'm the only one in the world doing the right thing. And if there's 7 billion, 14 billion, or whatever it is, that's great.
Right.
And that's a very basic part of integrating chassidus. So that knowing who you are is not a reflection of how other people see you. Now, for a teenager, it's when you lock into that, it's very empowering. It's not always such an easy process. Something that I also, at this stage, a lot of my stories, especially about my childhood, are things that I've said over a lot. But I remember at one point, my brother, the one that's closest to me in the in age, we're walking to shul with my father, and we see that people are like, we were uncomfortable with how people would stare at him. He didn't even notice. He couldn't care less. His hat, his beard, his tzitzis, and in those years, either a hat or, certainly a beard and tzitzis, a yarmulke, was not something, you did not see this on the streets of Nashville, Tennessee in the 50s and 60s. But he didn't notice. I mean, he knows who he is. He knows who he is, so he had no issue. But we were little kids, so we were, kind of uncomfortable. So if it was somebody, if it was in the street, so we would just stare at their shoes. When you stare at somebody's shoes, so they get uncomfortable. They start looking at their shoes, So that was our way of, as little kids, that was our way of. But what we incorporated, what we had to try to integrate was this idea of being so comfortable in your own skin that whatever anybody else says just rolls off your back. But I think one of the things that I found most frustrating, and I still do, and people will say this, well, it's easy for you. You grew up that way. Like as if somebody programmed me at the age of 5 or whatever age, and then I just go off on automatic pilot, and now I'm set for the rest of my life. When you see a 5-year-old keeping Shabbos, it tells you a lot about the 5-year-old. When you see a 30-year-old keeping Shabbos, you have no idea. Maybe they grew up with it, maybe they didn't. But one thing is for sure, even if they grew up with it, if he's 30 years old and he's keeping Shabbos, it's because at some point this person made the decision, maybe not in so many words, maybe not because of an internal struggle, maybe yes with an internal struggle, but at some point took ownership. This is mine. That's not the sign of a gap. That's not the sign of something being wrong. It's the sign of a healthy development. To go adolescence is part of how the Eibishter programmed us.
Right. Yeah, I mean, there's always a sense that the world, ever since the postmodernists took over, and whether one likes it or not, much of the way we think of ourselves and we think of the world is shaped by how they thought of it. It's the catchword has been authenticity. Everybody's into being authentic today, and to being, you have to be honest, you have to be real, you have to be authentic, right? And so there's always a sense that where do you see authenticity? When someone rebels, then they're being authentic, right? Or when someone, even if it's not rebellion, if someone chooses away from how they grew up, by definition, that's a sign of authenticity, because why would they do it if not for the fact, right? And if someone stays, then they're not authentic.
Do you see how limited that is and how limiting?
No, I don't agree with that take. I don't agree with that take. And there's even a trend now, and I kind of understand where they're coming from, but there's also a trend of, like the kids who leave Yiddishkeit, those kids have a deeper spiritual feeling, which is feeling locked up in this religion, and everyone else has what to learn from them. And while one can say, meaning while there may be something to learn, and very often is something to learn from what they have to say and what they think, like there is from anybody, and while it is sometimes, or maybe even often, the case that there is a very deep spiritual sense of search or questioning that's pushing them in a different direction, the idea that you can only find it there and not in the quote unquote boring, or just regular person, I think is quite damaging. And I think that's why the anecdote with your father, the one that you just said, is very powerful. That being a nonconformist is in many ways the same thing as being a conformist, in the sense that you're letting the world frame the terms of the debate, right? The world says, okay, this is what we're about, this is what the story, this is what the game is, and now everybody chooses two sides of the game, right? The ultimate goal is to say, no, you don't tell me which game we're playing. I tell you which game I'm playing. Why do I tell you? Because I have a tradition, I have a belief of what the game really is, and I don't really care how you frame it. If you happen to fall on my side, great. If you don't, I'm going to continue doing my thing, right? But it sounds great, and there's no question that the story of Lubavitch is very much a story of the tradition of Avram Avinu, Echadai Avram. I don't think there's a question about it. Like the more I think about it, other groups of chassidus, other chassidim, they're all very much defined by the city they grew. Meaning back in Poland, the town that they lived in was the chassidus that they were part of, and that's why very often you hear stories of them. They moved to a different town and they joined the other group. Lubavitchers were scattered all over the place. There was this idea that the whole Lubavitch community was ever in Lubavitch is just not true. Most of them didn't live in Lubavitch.
That's right.
Right? And until Tenchet Mimim was established, I don't think there ever was a really solid presence there. Even the Rebbeim weren't there a lot of the time. They were traveling. A lot of them needed to go for health reasons and askanas. So the idea that there was like this kind of cloistered community where everyone gained strength in the community, it's certainly not the story of Lubavitch, and the story of independence and independent thought is for sure a feature of the Lubavitch story. I think ultimately it asks a question of what does a Lubavitch community look like when everyone is so independent minded. But like what you're saying is that independent minded is not in the opposition of being with other people, or like if there's other people who have the same principles as I do, wonderful. I don't have to be, an iconoclast. I don't have to be the only person. But I think it's not so simple. Like I think very often when you're brought up with that kind of iconoclastic way of thinking, where a chassid macht es viva, and you kind of bulldoze the environment with your principles.
Wait a minute.
1 second.
Not bulldoze. Not bulldoze. That's not Lubavitch.
Okay, but when you are
cultivate.
Okay, fair. That's the way it should. But when you are put under pressure, right? When you are put under pressure, whether it's a child growing up in a community with very few other people like them, whether it's a shliach that goes out to another town, whether it's the chassidim that were just living in Brooklyn before there were other people to come. Yes, there's a sense of cultivating, but there's also a sense of defiance. Is there not? It's not also pretty and elegant. There is a certain sense of, like, even you mentioned earlier that there were plenty of chassidim that came to America that weren't so strong. They kind of let their kids, they kind of gave up on their kids holding the line. They're like, okay, this is, so the people that stood, is it all that elegant and tidy?
I don't know if elegant and tidy would be a
Right.
word that I would use for it.
Well, cultivating sounds very.
Well, I think it's a question of how we look at community.
Right.
My father was the rabbi of the shul for roughly 50 years.
Right.
Many of the people in the shul that he taught, very often, when their Yiddishkeit started to mean a whole lot more to them, they would move, and this is an experience that many, many, many shluchim have had, that they move to a larger community with more opportunities for education for their children, for high school, and beyond. If it's a question of looking at what the community is, it's very hard to gauge accomplishment. But if it's a question that you're looking for impact, you're looking, and it's an idea that I think is more characteristic of our time right now than any time before, although obviously it's always there. V'atem to look to echad echad, the individual connections. We're not looking to build a community for the sake of the community. Like, I'm here and I have to make sure that this community is good. Of course you want to be a positive force. Of course you want to build communities. But really what we're looking at is impacting lives.
But that's precisely my point.
Yeah.
Is that that's a very deep part of the Lubavitch ethos. There's no question about it. And so today, in many ways, I feel like that runs in opposition to having vibrant Lubavitch communities. And I think as Lubavitch communities do grow, and there are more and more around the country, and I'm sure around the world, I think that's one of the tensions that are being sorted out now, which is, there is a beautiful strength in community. I think you look at the Frum communities in America, including Lubavitch communities, and the different mices that they have, that only communities could pull off together. Whether it's the famous, Hatzalah and the Shmir and these things, but then there are all kinds of quieter organizations, right? It's a beautiful thing, and it's a very strong power. But in many ways, that takes away from the individual, and the individual's need to resourcefulness to speak for himself. On the flip side, the Lubavitch ethos of being a strong individual, I think, can rub up against the community. Like, what do I need a community for? Or am I missing something if I give too much to the community?
So I'm not an expert on Lubavitch communities. I lived in
Fair
Crown
enough.
Heights for 2 years of my life when my
Fair
husband
enough.
was in Kiel. But I would say that I have very deep ties to Crown Heights, and I'm very fond of Crown Heights. And I would say that the people in Crown Heights who impressed me the most in the years that I was very much there, even though I didn't live there, and in all the years since, are what is the idea of seeing yourself as one what? You mentioned, we was talking about Avram, right? So I was talking about of being the one, but he was a giver.
Right.
He was a giver. He saw himself not in terms of what he can get from the community, but he was giving. And I think of the people that I know in the Lubavitch community or in any community, in Crown Heights or wherever, is that those people who look at their lives as, what am I contributing? What am I giving? Am I a giver? And that's the same Avram Avinu. So it's not like I don't intend for anything that I'm saying to be anti-community.
No, I didn't understand.
You didn't get that.
No,
You
I
didn't get that.
No,
That's
no.
fine.
I certainly didn't
But I
know.
think
And
that
I'm also not anti-community. I think it's just interesting when you talk about the Lubavitch kind of individualism. Like America likes to talk about rugged individualism, but of course this is coming from a different place. You talk Echad HaYavram. I think the question that needs to be thought about is, how does that fit into a communal ethos?
So in a communal ethos, the more people you have who are looking out for what other people need, for what can I give, how can I contribute, that leads to only the most beautiful and strong and vibrant and healthy community. It was something that you could feel. I was in Eretz Yisrael about 6 weeks ago for a week. I've been there many times in my life. It was the most incredible trip that I ever had. And the thing that was so striking was that feeling of achdus among people, not achdus in the group of people that are like me,
Right.
but just across the board, where barriers, you heard it, you saw it, you felt it, you could touch it. The barriers came down, and people, what is it that ties us, that binds us? And I think the impetus, that engine that drives that is, what can I give you? What do you need from me? How can I help you? How can I support you? Even little things like the way people, traffic. the way drivers look out for each other. You don't find the nightmare of Israeli traffic from not so long ago. It's like you feel people are saying, let me cut him a little slack. Who knows what he had to deal with this morning? And just on the bus, in the grocery store, wherever it is, that sense of, and that's what I mean by giving, that sense of what does somebody need from me that I can give? How can I help? How can I support? And in a Lubavitch community, when somebody comes in, and it's happened in places that were for many, many years, just, the Chabad house with serving the community and trying to help develop and raise the Yiddishkeit and so on. When people who identify as Lubavitchers come into that community, if they come in with the attitude of how do we help this place grow, we're coming here with gifts that not everybody has. We have the benefit of the education, of whatever, all the different things. And now we're joining a community. How can we help this community? As opposed to, what are you doing for me?
I mean, I'm listening to what you're saying. I think it's just a matter of rereading the line, a chassid macht a sviva. A chassid makes a surrounding. I think very often the connotation of that is, it's oppositional, right? It's there's individual, there's a surrounding. The surrounding either takes either takes you over or you take the surrounding over. I think even that's the way the phrase starts. Like a sviva macht a. Like a sviva could make you, but a chassid macht a sviva, right? And I think what you're saying is that there's another way to read it, which is probably just as accurate, and that it could be additive, right? Instead of you're oppositional to the sviva, you could also be additive to the sviva, right? Not necessarily does the sviva always have to be seen in opposition to you. Right. It can be something that you can lend a hand to, and I just want to be clear. I'm not suggesting that people don't know this or that people need my guidance on how to build better communities. I just think it's interesting more theoretically. There are many beautiful communities, Lubavitch communities, and many people doing great things in these Lubavitch communities.
100%.
And I'm not trying to critique them. It's just, I think when we're talking about the individual ethos of Lubavitch, I think it's interesting to talk about how that fits in with what we're seeing today, which is more growth of communities. And I think there can be a tension there. And I think what you're suggesting here is that it doesn't have to be in opposition. And it goes back to the story also of your father, which, right, where if being individual is about not being contrarian to everybody else, but being principled about what you do. So if you're in principle, if it's about the principles, so if you need to be against it, you'll be against it. But if you can be for it, that's also a good thing. It's the same. It comes from the same place. But I do want to go back, and this is the thing that we were going to speak about at the beginning. You mentioned earlier that you came to Beis Rivka, and now that we've gone through a lot of the, kind of in a messy way, we've kind of gone through the story. That's fine. That's just how conversations go. But, you grew up in Nashville. You grew up with parents who had grown up also in kind of isolation or, not in these vibrant communities that reflected their Lubavitch values, and grandparents also that had lived that way. So this is a very deep part of your identity at that and your experience at that point. You said you came to Beis Rivka, and there were two things that struck me when you told me the story of Beis Rivka, which was and to be honest, I was surprised by the story. I thought the way that you're telling the story, I thought you were going to end up in Beis Yaakov. That's and I know that's how you set it up, but that's how I understood. Okay, Beis Yaakov was more convenient, an out of town girl. Your aunt went to Beis Yaakov. That's what she said when I spoke to her. Okay, you go to Beis Yaakov. But you said
there was no alternative.
I understand.
No, she loved her Beis Yaakov experience. She's very clear about that.
Yeah. Somebody, I think my great grandfather wanted her father to lie about her age so she could go to Beis Rivka or something. But yes, I understand. No, but I was the way the story was being presented to me. I was like, okay, you're gonna go to Beis Yaakov and you're gonna apologize for it. But you went to Beis Rivka, and there were two things that stuck out to me. One of them was this picture of this chassid who you had never met before, and I don't even know if he was close with your father, but there was this sense of familiarity and just he was not buttoned up, like he was running the school, but he was walking around with the cleaning detergent, like there wasn't this kind of,
Right.
like officialness or whatever. And so there was a warmth and a sense of family that you sensed right away. And then the next thing you said, or another thing that stuck out to me, was there's a picture of the Rebbe. And I don't think those two things are a contradiction, but I do think they're two different things. I don't think they're the same necessarily, right? And this is what we were talking about before we started the podcast, right? What I sensed from your father and this Itcha Golden that they're meeting was a sense of brotherhood and familiarity, which was something that was developed by either they knew each other from before, or they had a shared history, or shared traditions, shared so many things that they shared, and there's a very tight connection there. The picture of the Rebbe is a much more abstract thing. It's just a picture on the wall, right? It's a picture on the wall, and yet you said that's when you felt that here is a place that I belong. I think that's the words that you used.
I felt at home.
You felt at home. I think that's a very interesting thing, especially also, now that we've spoken about community and individualism. What do you think, now that I've kind of isolated those two things? How do you see those two things? Are they the same? Are they different?
So the first part is easier to tease apart. My father actually did know Rabbi Golden from when he was a bacher. The Friedrich Rebbe sent him and another bacher to Mendel Baumgarten to Europe, 1948, to visit the Platim. They most of the time in Paris, but they visited other places as well, but mostly in Paris. They were there, I think, for 4 or 5 months, maybe more. Officially, it was to bring back a report on the Platim. Unofficially, what we heard later, I didn't hear this from my father, but that a lot of the Anash were the Lubavitchers living in having left, just escaped from Russia, were worried about coming to America. How will they raise chassidish children here? So here's one bacher who was born in America, and another bacher who was raised in America from the age of 3. And they're, chassidish bachrim with untouched beards, and they learn chassidus, and they fabring, and they're, kind of like to reassure people it's possible. You can come to America, and your boys can look like them.
Very interesting.
And act like them. I did not ever hear that from my father. But I remember one time saying to my father that it feels to me like your experience in Paris was very, very formative in your life, like one of the most important experiences that you had. So he said that when they had yichidus, after they came back and they gave over the report, and then the Friedrich Rebbe said to them, "Und was hat ihr gehabt von dem? And what did you have from this?" And he laughed out loud. In other words, the impact that it had on them. And my father, for the rest of his life, there were certain Fabrengans that he would recall, and you could see him reliving them, and the people that he met. And
the Fabrengans in Paris.
In Paris.
Of chassidim.
The chassidim, yeah. And you could see the impact that it had. And it also, it was very big for him. So yeah, he did know Rabbi Golden from then. There was that connection. And the people that he met who knew his father from the years in Lubavitch, and they were kids. My grandfather was like 14 years old in Lubavitch
when he left.
Yeah, he was and then they learned in other yeshivas, but still.
When Lubavitch broke up, he was
14 years old.
Right.
But it was, obviously huge in his life. So, there is that shared experience. And that warmth, it should be a characteristic of who we are as chassidim. When you talk about the Rebbe, I do not recall my parents speaking a lot about the Rebbe when we were kids. And yet, I remember there was one year, it was Yud Shvat Tavshin Chav, so I was 8.5. And my father said something to my mother in Yiddish, which I did not speak, but somehow or other I understood what he said. And what he had said was, Ich habe gemacht reservaties. I made reservations. And I knew he was going, and I just, right away, I jumped in and I said, can I go, can I go? And, the parents look at each other. You sense a little bit of an opening, so you drive a Mack truck through it. So, and I'm putting it, please, 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 can I go?
Kids were like that back then too?
Oh, no. Please, can I go? Please, can I go? And they said yes. So now I'm going. I remember the suitcase. I remember what I packed, and I'm going with them, and I'm going.
I don't think I asked you. You're the oldest, right?
I'm the oldest, yeah.
Okay.
And we were walking out of the shul. We were leaving from the shul when somebody was taking us to the airport. The phone rang. Somebody had passed away. My father had to stay. There was no trip. And what I remember so vividly is that, of course, I was hysterical. I was crying my eyes out. And my father didn't try to stop me. He didn't say, okay, I remember him just like looking at me with a sad smile. I felt like he totally empathized. And the sense that I got without him saying a word was that it's okay to cry that you can't see the Rebbe.
That's why you were crying?
Well, partly. I'm sure I was crying because I wasn't going on the plane and I wasn't gonna whatever, have all the
right.
glamour and the drama of that. But I did know that I was going to the Rebbe. Mm-hmm. And I do remember that feeling like the world went black, that I couldn't.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact, it made such an impression on me because by nature, I think my father would have been more inclined, if it was something else, he would have been more inclined to okay, let's, move on. You know what I'm saying? The fact that I felt validated.
Mm.
Now, in my mind, it was a trip to the Rebbe. And now what does that mean for an 8.5-year-old? I have no idea.
Had you ever been to the Rebbe before?
Yeah.
So you had been?
I had been. I had been. My parents took me for Yechidus when I was about 2, and then never again until I came to New York, and then, with my mother. And why they didn't was because my father had very long Yechidus, and I was 2-year-old, so I was sitting on the floor. My mother gave me her pocketbook to play with, and all of a sudden my parents see that I was smiling broadly, and they're not talking about anything remotely amusing, and they glanced down, and I had dumped out her entire purse all over the floor of the Rebbe's office. And so my mother had to stand there when my father jammed everything in, and they didn't want to take us into Yechidus after that for a very long time. But I knew, maybe I can picture till today how my father would look when he was on the phone with Maskirs getting an answer from the Rebbe. Mm. I knew that this was big. I knew that this was very, very big, and that it was something that my parents always said that there was nothing about shlichus that they felt was hard or a challenge. And this was in the days before you could, order food and all of that kind of stuff. And even being far away and family, none of that really bothered them, except for one thing that they found hard, and that was sending children away.
Wow.
For school. And my mother said that the hardest thing was that there were people in the community who were like, how could you do that? How could you send, even though I was going to be living with her parents and so on, which was obviously a big piece of it, but still, how could you do that? How could you do that? One woman said to my mother, I understand you. You're sending her away now. You're sending her far now, so you'll be close later. My generation was the first ones of the real, the student rebellion and all of that. And one girl in my original class, one married whatever, some Eastern religion thing, and one was in a commune and somewhere in New England, married to a non-Jew, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But in 1961, nobody saw that coming.
Right.
And that one, she says that she clung to that.
Your mother clung
My
to
mother clung to that one drop of understanding that you're sending her far now, so you'll be close later. So what was it that motivated them? It was something. It came from the Rebbe. There wasn't a question that it was going to happen, but it was not. There was not a martyrdom with it. There was not like it was.
I'm not suggesting that there was. It's just
I understand.
It's just. I think because this ties to the topic that originally we were going to speak about. We can still speak about, which is you have a unpublished essay that the Rebbe doesn't have. The Rebbe
God doesn't have grandchildren, and neither does the Rebbe.
The Rebbe doesn't have grandchildren. So what do you mean by that?
So what I mean by that, and it's something that is very basic to my understanding of who I am as a Jewish woman, who I am as a chassid, who I want to be in this world. Each person has to forge their own connection. This is not something new. This is not something post Gimel Tammuz. This has nothing to do with whether you're born into a Lubavitcher family or not. In some ways, there could be more of a challenge when you come from a Lubavitcher background, because you kind of think that it's your birthright. You kind of think that you own it. This is who I am.
Right, it's a way of life.
More than that, it's your whole identity.
Right.
So I had an argument with a bacher who was helping us out one yontif, and I said, "There's no such thing as being born a Lubavitcher." And he said, "Yes, there is." And he was, bringing proofs of, if you're born to a family that, whatever, he quoted something or other. So, okay, I'll concede your point. Maybe you could be. But if you don't work with it, then it's not going to amount to anything. Mm-hmm. And, there's the story about the guy that comes into a restaurant, and something about it just doesn't feel quite right. It's a kosher restaurant. He starts asking the owner, who was not exactly a hadras panim of a, the most inspiring in terms of his Jewish appearance. He's asking him questions. He doesn't like the answers so much. And finally, the owner points to a picture behind him on the wall, a guy with a beard. And he says, "Oh, it's my grandfather." He says, if your grandfather was behind the counter and he had a picture of you on the wall, I'd be a lot more comfortable. There's the famous answer that exchange. The Rebbe was speaking to George Rohr, and he had started the beginner's minyan at KJ many, many years ago, and he used the term people who have no background whatsoever. Right? I'm not going to go into the whole story now, but how the Rebbe totally did not accept that. Right. And everybody has a background. They are all the children of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, and Leah. Fine. And that's a given. And if you take it a step further, every single identifiable Jew today you're not going to go back 20 generations, not more than 3, 4, maybe 5 even. Not just that they're Jewish, the people who had Mesiras Nefesh for Yiddishkeit.
Right, otherwise they wouldn't be here.
They would have just, filtered out. At the same time, you have to do the work. And I believe that was one of the Rebbe's most dominant themes from always. Like in the very first Farbrengen, the Farbrengen, Yud Aleph Shvat, Tavshin Yud Aleph, when the Rebbe said the Maimer and officially accepted the Nesias. And in the Sikha then, the Rebbe says, don't think that you appointed somebody, and now everybody can just go, live your comfortable lives. Ir daftan alein, you have to do the work.
Yeah.
And again, like it's something that feels like almost like a mantra for me, because when it occurred to me, I didn't hear it, the understatement of history. The Rebbe says, helfen. I'm not going to be stingy about helping you. If there's something that I can help you with, I'll help you. But that's how the Rebbe is describing his role. You have to do the work.
Right.
So what does that mean? So in one of your podcasts, I was very taken with this idea of does being a chassid or a chassidal. I think it was with Rabbi Driesen, where he was talking about the person who's just repeating what the Rebbe says,
Yeah.
or incorporating it, integrating it, making it your own. And this was something that I heard from my father my whole life. I don't remember having long discussions with him personally about ideas,
Right.
but I do remember sitting in shul and listening to him speak, and sitting at pagishas and listening to him speak. I always had a way in because I was his daughter, so I could go. It was the men's pagisha, the women's, it didn't matter. I could come and listen. And the ideas that he articulated, and one of them, that's the basis really of his book, Think Jewish, were his speeches, his talks for the encounters with college students. And there's one chapter that I think like it should be required reading for everybody everywhere. Between challenge and response, a function of faith. He says, usually we think of faith in terms of emunah and so on. He says, but there's a different kind of, when we say that Torah is nitzchi, that's an eternal truth, what does it mean? Are we just, now I'm paraphrasing this, I'm not quoting now, we're not like a living, we're not a living Sturbridge Village, a living museum of how they lived 200 years ago, and that's how we're going to live now.
Right.
We're not just, transporting it forward, this old way of life, and we're doing now like they did then. No, it's always in the context. When you say new, it means there's a challenge,
Right.
and there's a response.
Right.
Now, between the challenge and the response, there can be a gap.
Right.
So one of the examples that my father gives is the style of Jewish learning until the Enlightenment, bulldozed its way into Eastern Europe. So the focus of Jewish learning was basically on how to live as a Yid.
Right.
And is this
Halacha.
halacha? Is it okay? So there was already for a good 200 years all of the things that Chassidus brought in, and that it should be a more vibrant, more meaningful experience, the emotional experience of what davening should be, and the emotional involvement in mitzvahs, which, if you just parenthetically, we have such a gift of vocabulary now for emotional intelligence. And for me personally, to understand principles of Chassidus with that vocabulary opens up a whole new world. But whatever. But learning, the world of learning, the Jewish world of scholarship was focused on how.
Mm-hmm.
The Enlightenment, the move to America, and now everything is being questioned, and everything.
That's why.
That's why. So there was a gap. Now, there were responses to that gap. But there was space in between before the response could be articulated. One of the most moving tributes I personally ever heard of what my father's role was, and I believe continues to be, because he has many students who have taken what he pioneered and took it further, but it wasn't just translating into using a dictionary, translating words. It was translating concepts, translating ideas. In other words, to be able to understand the idiom, not in the grammatical sense, to be able to understand the mindset of a Westerner, of, say, an American. Where are people thinking? Right. Where are they coming from? That kind of translation.
Right. I mean, he had in many ways the challenge, but also the gift of working with a completely blank canvas.
Yeah.
Like there were no cliches yet of like, you want to teach a chassidic concept of, of Avodas Hatfila or whatever he was talking about, or the Pintele Yid, let's say, basic concepts of Chassidus. There's literally he must have had zero cliches to fall back on, and like you also said, he had to explain it to people who were foreign to it, and he had to speak to them in their language.
So the description that I found very, very moving was from Rabbi Vogel, Rabbi Feivish Vogel, describing my father's accomplishments, and that he put things into words
Yeah.
that addressed the mindset of young Western thinkers.
But a lot of times people focus on that in terms of hafetza. But what I'm drawn to in that anecdote or that praise of your father, which is not the first time I'm hearing it, and I've read some of the things he's written, so I'm familiar with that too, is it's not just about hafetza. That's a wonderful talent and a capability, but it was his capacity to think as an individual.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
Right. But here's where to me it gets more complicated because, let's say someone heard about your father. If someone knew about your father only from this podcast, right? So the last time they heard about your father was a story where your father was getting very upset. Was it at Mrs. Gorelick herself or the sister of Mrs. Gorelick for staying too long in the Yechidus? And he sounds like a very like kind of like bulldozer kind of, you know what I mean? And I don't know.
I've heard that story, but I'd like to reflect on that story a little bit.
No, but you
I know what you're talking about.
No, but you understand what I'm
Want to
asking.
repeat it? You could. Yeah, you can go ahead.
You understand what I'm asking?
You
though?
can spell out the question if you'd like.
As long as
As long as I get it.
Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
it's like people. There's clearly a tension there between the the chassid and the very dominant presence of the Rebbe, right? Which is very dominant in his or her life, and then okay.
Okay.
You've had enough
Okay,
of my
so-
question.
No. You can by all means elaborate on it, but I want to put that story into context
Fair.
because I think it's it could be very helpful for us in the challenges that our generation is facing now. That conversation took place.
So let's recap the conversation.
Go ahead.
As far as I remember it, is that your aunt, one of your aunts, not Mrs. Grelick, her sister, right?
My mother-in-law, Mrs. Deren. I'm married to my first cousin.
Right. So
Right,
Mrs. Deren went in for Yechidus as a kala.
No, she was ready. My husband's parents were married a week after my parents. They were also married in Kislev Tafshin.
So they were in Yechidus after their wedding?
So this was, they got married, it was still B'chayev of the Frierdiker Rebbe. So this was now a year later, and they were all in New York for my Uncle Label's wedding.
Right.
My Uncle Label, Posner, Zeller Zeingesund, got married Lamed Shvat Tafshin Yud Aleph.
Right.
So his was the first wedding after the Rebbe was Makabel and Asiyas.
Right.
As the Rebbe said to my aunt's father, the Kala's father, that during this whole year I didn't go to any weddings. Your daughter's wedding is the first wedding that I'm going to, which just
The
parenthetically.
Derens.
No.
The Derens are already married. The Derens are already married. Okay.
Label Posner's wedding. So my aunt's parents were not chassidim, and I thought that was such a beautiful, just a tiny little thing. Your daughter's wedding. When he's talking to the father of the Kala,
Right.
and
The
your daughter's wedding. In any case, so this Yechidus was around this time.
This Yechidus with your other aunt, Deren.
My mother, yeah. So she was saying how wonderful it felt, and that she felt like she just didn't want to leave.
Right.
And in the story, the way my Aunt Bessie tells it, and I'm not quarreling with her, but it's very interesting to me because she describes how my father was just frantic. What? You stayed? How could you stay? How could you take that up his time? So on and so forth. Now, I have a hard time, and again, I'm not doubting it. I have a very hard time picturing my father that way because I file it under a completely different heading.
Huh.
And I file it. I'm not even sure that he was in New York that whole year. This is a year after Yud Shvat Tafshin Yud, after the Stalkus of the Frierdiker Rebbe. The first time my mother was ever on a plane was to come to New York for the Levaya. My father had been on a plane. I don't even know if they came to New York during that year. My father did have interactions with the Rebbe during that year, and he felt that the Rebbe answered him as a Rebbe, but it was a very difficult year. Very, very difficult year. I heard from my grandfather, Kazarnovsky, who was, as much as he showed, which was hardly anything, he concealed way more than he revealed. But that it was a very, very monumental task that chassidim had to persuade the Rebbe to accept the Nesias. And I can't imagine that anybody was having an easy time.
I think your grandfather was very involved with
My
that.
grandfather was very involved. This is my mother's father. And actually, there's something from my father's father, but leave that for right now, that's printed, actually, in Igris Kodesh.
Let's get back to...
Get back to my father, right.
Okay.
It can't have been anything other than a word that is very overused, maybe even trivialized inappropriately, but very real. They were traumatized. They were traumatized. And the process of, like that first chassid who jumped up on the table that night and said, Mazel tov, Rebbe, we have a Rebbe, that process had not yet taken hold fully, for sure. And people were just discovering who the Rebbe was and what it meant to have a connection. So that my father could lash out, they were groping. They were groping. Now, just parenthetically, my father had...
You say, one second. I just want to understand the difference that you're making. You're saying that it wasn't coming from a place of like I'm a big chassid. What you did was wrong. I'm giving you. It's more like it's more just confusion.
An emotional outburst.
Confusion.
Yeah, I don't know if confusion. Maybe just.
Well, that's what groping sounds like. Okay.
Yeah.
You said groping, like not uncertain of what to make of it, and is this the right thing, the wrong thing?
Under certain circumstances, it would be.
Right. But when you're unsure,
it was a premeditated. This is how it has to be.
Right.
But one thing I can tell you that he did describe for me that, and I'm not sure if it's in his book, but he had this idea that a Rebbe is born, a Rebbe is not made, and that there were things that the Bachrim in 770 in the 40s, and he was there, his years as a Bacher were those years. They had all kinds of interactions with the Rebbe's brother-in-law, with Rashag. And they were light, and there was some humor, there was a banter, there was,
right.
there was not, whatever, just some of them are funny, some of them persist down till today. But it was not at all heavy, not at all, it wasn't like, well, he's in this role, so we have to treat him,
right.
nothing, not crossing boundaries, but they were not awestruck.
Right.
He said it never, ever occurred to anybody, it just didn't happen, that anyone had that kind of interaction with the Rebbe. That he just, by his being, he was connected. He would talk to people. One of my favorite, by the way, videos from that time, a video describing that time is Shimshon Stak Olav Hashem describing how the Rebbe was talking to him and offered to learn with him. But that it's just so precious It's so beautiful. That there's warm and there's human connection. But he commanded respect because of who he was. And if the Rebbe wanted someone to do something, if he asked he did something for a printer or this or that, there wasn't a question about it. To discuss something, there was no chaverlap, we're buddies. Not even people who were older. It was just that very deep sense of respect was something that anybody that had any interaction with the Rebbe during those years, it was just there. So, certainly for chassidim who were in America, who saw the Rebbe, knew the Rebbe, there was never a question. Not even a whisper of a question.
But there was still sorting out to be done, is what you were saying.
Whatever. I mean, that there was why it took a year. There's a whole, a lot of that. But my point is.
No, I'm saying no, that's not what my point. My point was that it was sorting out on the part of your father, because you're saying even after the year, it was still unsettled. There was still things that they were sorting out in their own minds, which is why he.
So I don't know if I used the word. Sorry, you said that I used the word groping, and maybe I did. I don't remember that. I think it was. Look, there was no question that, and this is just a few weeks later.
Right.
There was no question that there was a sense of, you'd have to say, relief or gratitude.
Right.
That, but I'm saying that in my father's reaction in the story that my Aunt Bessie told, that it wasn't, I think there's a lot of deep emotion that came out that way, but his way was not bulldozer ever.
You're saying it's uncharacteristic of him, and there must be a different dynamic.
Okay.
There must be something. There must be something else going on.
I
don't think she meant it, by the way, to describe him. Just to be fair, I don't think that was the point. The story had come up to describe how the family had kind of reacted to the transition from one Rebbe to another. And so that, in that sense, to me, it's very interesting, because if I remember correctly, she sees that anecdote as an indication of how quickly the family moved from one to the other. No, but what you're saying is almost the opposite. That there was meaning in terms of acceptance, it may have been immediate, but the transition was not yet.
No,
not
at all. No.
Okay.
No, I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying that it would be uncharacteristic of him to sort of lash out in that way at his sister, with whom he was very close.
Right. So why would he do it?
So I think that was just the emotional overload of that time.
Right, but emotional overload indicates.
It's not confusion.
I didn't say, okay, so let's take out the word confusion.
Not confusion. It's not even groping.
So let's take that word out too. Let's strike that, both of those words from the record. But it does push back at the sense of kind of just, one to another without
skipping a beat.
Meaning, even if someone has Kabbalah soil, or someone says in their mind that yes, it's all the same, and each Rebbe is a hemshich of the other, you're saying there's still emotional turmoil, which is understandable. I don't say that in any way. I mean, to me,
I would see the emotional turmoil in the fact that there was something quite unique in this situation, and that is by the Rebbe Rashab. I don't know what it was like for chassidim then, and that it was going to be the Rebbe Rashab or even the Rebbe Maharash, and there were other possible candidates, but certainly by
a lot of turmoil.
Yeah, okay, so whatever. So that's one thing. But let's say from the Rebbe Rashab to the Frierdiker Rebbe, there was no question, but there was a lot of emotional stuff. So I would say but at least they knew who.
Right.
There were no.
He was the heir apparent for many years.
Yeah, and so they were not. They didn't have to hold their breath.
Right.
Of what's going to happen. Here, it wasn't so clear. And the fact that the Rebbe was resisting it
Right.
it didn't promote peace of mind. So
Right.
I don't think it was a question of the difficulty of the transition per se. How do you go from one to the other? I think it was a reflection of that, like, whew, it happened.
An emotionally exhausting
An
year.
emotionally exhausting year, but not the difficulty of transition in that way.
Okay, so the reason I'm kind of sticking on this
Yeah.
is not to I'm not like a historian that needs to know exactly what happened at the story or trying
Right,
to,
right.
but to me it's very important in the sense that, first of all, however you take the story, it opens up the idea of the Rebbe as the not abstract thing, because in abstraction, yes, one Rebbe is followed by another Rebbe, Gzer, Shav, it's all the same, right? And you just move from one to the other without pause. But in the real world, right, meaning, or in the world that's not abstract, when you go from the world of symbols to the world of messy feelings and ups and downs and days and nights and things, uncertainty, things don't work in straight lines,
Right.
right? In that world, there is turmoil. Now, the turmoil may not be in the clarity of what should come next or where your loyalty lies, but there's turmoil just in like you described, like will he take it, will he not take it, will we have a Rebbe, will we not have a Rebbe, right? There's turmoil there, and when you have it, there's still exhaustion, and so sorry.
No, go ahead.
So to me, why am I fixated on it? Because going back to the story of the picture of the Rebbe in Bisrivka, to me, there's always this, not always. To me, there is this idea of the Rebbe as an abstract symbol. Okay, these people, their loyalties are with the Rebbe. My loyalties are with the Rebbe. We are a community, right? But a community, to me, is much more about the Itcha Golden connection with your father and the real connections that are built over experiences and shared loyalties to the Rebbe also. That's also part of it, right? You could even say you want to say something.
No. I'm listening. I'm moving things around, but I'm listening.
Okay, fair enough. And
Go ahead.
So to me, there's a symbolic identity, let's say. A Lubavitch chassid is a chassid of the Lubavitch Rebbe, right? That's a symbolic identity. But then there's a real, and I shouldn't use the word real because that means symbolic isn't real, but there's a embodied, because I'm not your father and I don't have the best vocabulary, and unsymbolic, whatever the opposite of symbolic is, or whatever is a lack of symbolic, the kind of messy identity, which is more just a buildup of shared experiences and shared memories and shared relationships and Shabbos table, sharing a Shabbos table together, or learning a mimer together, or sharing gossip together over the years, a collection of all these different things, and that connect us as people. Right, and so that's why I fixated on that, because your father seems to be a fascinating. He seems to be a very striking example of both. That's where I'm getting at, right? That's where I'm getting at, and that's why that story by Sifka is also very telling to me, because it seems like he had both very loyal to the Rebbe, and you growing up, the Rebbe was clearly a North Star in your home, right? And a very, very important part of his identity. But you're also being very careful to point out that your father was a very unique individual person, right? Who would not just I don't need to talk in the negative, even the positive. he had very deep relationships, individual relationships with people that I don't think they have to be in opposition to one another, these two things, the abstract and the kind of messy identities. I don't think they have to, I think in many ways they support one another. You have the idea of the identity up here, and then you have the lived identity down here, and they kind of, they push it, they maybe run in parallel and they inform one another, right? You see what I'm saying?
I see what you're saying.
Well,
So if you don't mind, I want to kind of pull back a little bit.
Go ahead.
And it's fascinating to me how much of our discussion is, weaving back and forth about my father. His yahrzeit was just a week ago, by the way, 10 years. And one of the things that strikes me in this conversation that I don't think I was ever able to quite articulate it this way, even for myself, is that for somebody who was as articulate as he was, and again, not just good vocabulary, but he could bring ideas, bridge all kinds of gaps because he could see where this one's coming from and see what this one is listening to, and he could just bridge gaps, but the way that he could talk about things. So he's the articulate person. And what I saw in him, and I can think of so many examples of it, things that were really, really deep and really meaningful to him, he could barely speak about. And I think in retrospect that I learned more from his silences than from his words. I said to you before that they didn't speak a lot about the Rebbe. I can picture him, writing down a phone call with Maskiris. But I'm thinking about it now, and that realizing that my father used to tell a story in completely different context about someone he was, I don't know if it's a true story or not, in Europe, of a fellow his wife passed away, and somebody suggested as a shidduch her sister. And the idea was brought to the father of these two sisters, and he said no. He doesn't want his other daughter to marry the alman of his first daughter. And why not? He said, because he spoke so beautifully at the levaya. He said, if at a moment like that he could speak that well, then he didn't really love her. He doesn't want his second daughter to marry this guy. And I know that was something that he carried deeply, that at moments of, when something strikes very deeply, my Ushi actually wrote a very beautiful article about my father. I think he wrote it, could be that he wrote it when my father passed away. When my grandmother passed away, which was like 30-something years ago, it was in Tevis. That Pesach, we could never go to our parents really for Yontif because we had to be in our Beis Chabad, wherever we were at the time. And because my husband is a regional shliach, so we've been in different areas in our shlichus, but that's where we were. So we sent two of the kids. We sent Ashi and our daughter Chanis. We sent them to my parents for Pesach to make, and they had a wonderful, wonderful Pesach. And Ashi's description of that when my father got up to speak for Yisker, now this was the first time that he would be staying in shul for Yisker. It was after he was in the year of Avelis for his mother, and this was a few months later. And that he could barely speak. He said just a few words of introduction about it, and then he gave a motion of, that the chazan should continue. They announced Yisker, and that was it. And Ushi's description of that, the impact that had on him, and how he felt hearing that, and it was like he barely said two words, but you could see what he was And I've seen that in other things in his life. And I think that one of the things that a lot of people don't realize about him, and then especially because at the end of his life, he wasn't he wasn't able to be as articulate as he was earlier, that he could not easily discuss his connection to the Rebbe. But I had enough indications of things that I saw that showed me how deep it was. So on the surface, people could see that he was talking about his stories that he had about the Frierdiker Rebbe when he was a young bacher. And people didn't realize that, he wasn't as articulate in certain ways, but that the emotion was very deep.
But if it wasn't so articulate, so then why does that picture on the wall make you feel at home?
Because I got the emotional message. When I think about it now, why was I in New York? Right. I was in New York, not because my parents decided I have to go away. I was in New York because the Rebbe suggested it. And for my parents, there didn't need to be any more reason. And the fact in 1961 to send away a 10-year-old 1,000 miles away. So I could say they didn't have to tell me that because the Rebbe said and because we trust the Rebbe and so it was too deep to put into words. It would probably not have occurred to them. It probably would not have occurred to them, but it was just there. So I knew, the Rebbe's picture on the wall was not an abstraction. The Rebbe's picture on the wall was an expression of something real. This is mine. Now, in my father's book, where he has a chapter on what is a Rebbe, what is a chassid. This was an idea that I had heard from him, that it's up to each chassid to determine what his connection is going to be. It's not something that's imposed by the Rebbe. And in those cases where the Rebbe gives that's an unusual thing, but it's really more that the Rebbe is saying that he'll be our Rebbe to the extent that we want him to be. You want to just come for brachas? Here are the brachas. You want to come for more? What do you want? What do you want? And that has to be a very personal choice.
So the picture was not an abstraction.
Not at all.
It was not an abstraction.
It was to me a reminder of the thing that was most important to my parents, and that was and again, until this conversation now, I probably would not have been able to put it into words of why. But when you say abstract, I'm like, no, this is not abstract. But I want to ask you a question, and this is a little bit of what we were talking about in the beginning. How does this connect to where we are now? And I see very direct connections.
So I don't need to answer the question. Go ahead. Ask yourself a question.
But, one of the things I don't remember in connection with that we were talking about earlier, with that the Rebbe had said, Ir daftan alein.
Right.
And it's again, this idea, to what extent do you want to, to the extent that I can help you, no, if there is something with which I can help, I won't be stingy. And it's mind-boggling. But what's coming, what's the grassroots? Do you realize that most Mivtzaim came from the bottom up?
Yeah.
Came from people. And what does that mean? And initiatives in so many different ways.
Well, I think I'm sure. I know it exists to some extent today as well, but I think in many ways it's a lost art. I think the model that you're talking about, your father, and of course he wasn't the only one, but we're talking about him here, where he is able to be both a very shaped out individual, very specific. Everybody, when he spoke, he was speaking for himself. It was his ideas, everything that he said was not just, it came from somewhere.
Exactly.
No, I understand, but he processed it. He processed it, right?
Exactly.
And so there was an individual here who at the same time was as you're describing, a very deeply connected person to the Rebbe, a big chassid, very devoted to the Rebbe. And the way you're kind of explaining it is that in many ways, the fact that he was so articulate almost covered up on the fact that there was something you could say, well, he was articulate about these things, so those were the things that were important to him. No, if anything, the things that were important to him were the things that he couldn't articulate, which is very interesting. But he was clearly able to do both. I think in many ways that's a lost art.
Okay.
I think it's a lost art.
Okay.
But
So wait.
So you asked me what happened. You asked me what that means.
When you say lost art, there's a huge value judgment in that, and I'm not going to accept it.
Fair. Well, that's all I do here is I do value judgments.
No, why do I say I don't accept it?
I could defend it, but I could at least.
Oh, I can give you a million examples of it for sure. And what I'm objecting to is that lost puts it in the past.
That's not what I meant. A lost art's a phrase. A lost art is, you could have artists practicing a certain thing in the present, but it's not part of it. It's kind of a novelty. It's available, but it's not the thing. Without getting into big value judgments, I think there are some practical realities that are very easy to acknowledge. For example, your father, he was one of the first people, if not the first, to translate Chassidus into English. So he, by definition, has no. He's
among the first. He was not.
So among the first, but they had no past in terms of English to fall back on. They had to think for themselves by definition. There's nothing to go back to, right? They were also the first chassidim in America, right? Growing up in America. So the idea of being a chassid in America was also something that they had to figure out for themselves. Even if they didn't budge an iota from their religiosity and their Lubavitch identity from at all, and there was no sfeikus whatsoever, they still had to figure out what that meant growing up in America because they were pioneers in that regard, right? By definition, the people that come after them, especially a few generations later when there are thousands, they don't have that they don't have that need to be pioneering.
But what greater example can there be of a pioneering generation than post Gimel Tammuz?
Well, again, I'm not saying that there shouldn't be or there can't be.
No, I'm saying that there is.
Well, I would agree with you. If you're asking me, I would agree with you that in many ways if that generation was to think of itself as a pioneering generation, I think would be a very
Which generation?
The generation growing up today.
Yeah.
I think if I'm part of that generation, I suppose I am. I'm probably on the older end of the older side of the generation. But really, everybody's part of the generation if they're living today and growing up today, and everyone's growing up, right? So I don't know which age you would slice it off, but whoever thinks of themselves that way, right? If they thought of ourselves as a pioneering generation, that would be a great thing.
Absolutely.
I don't think though that's how they think.
Whoa.
Okay, so.
Whoa. Okay.
I don't.
So let's either narrow or maybe we should broaden our understanding of who is the they. Let's start with a given. I could promise, I don't know what to guarantee, but I have no doubt that 30 years ago, if somebody would say to you that you're going to be sitting 30 years from now, remember, Iyar
Right.
Nundalid, May of 1994,
Right.
was already after the Rebbe's second stroke.
Right.
A few weeks before Gimel Tammuz. If somebody would, and certainly go a little further in that summer,
Right.
the Gimel Tammuz would happen. Mashiach still didn't come.
Right.
30 years will go by, and Mashiach, it'll be Iyar, Today's Chedesh, Iyar, Tafshin Nun Dalid. It goes to
Pei
Tafshin
Daled.
Pei Dalid. Mashiach still didn't come. No one, first of all, most people would not be able to hear the words 30 years. Are you
Right.
crazy?
Right.
Are you crazy? What do you mean 30 years? How is such a thing even possible?
That doesn't make them pioneering.
Well, wait. We're a long way from the pioneering, okay? I remember that sukkahs, we had some people sitting in our sukkahs in Bachrim. And at one point, my husband said, we have to think, what's Lubavitch going to look like 5 years from now, 10 years from now? These were, Bachrim that we were pretty, very friendly with and so on. And, thinking along the same lines in many ways. So they got hysterical. They were frantic. What do you mean 5 years, 10 years? Mashiach's not going to be here 5 years, 10 years. How could you even let words like that out of your mouth? And my husband's sitting quietly. He's not saying anything. And I'm watching this whole thing go on. And they're like climbing the walls. I said, okay, could you calm down for a minute? If my husband is not going to explain himself, then I'm going to try. My husband is not talking about the calendar. What my husband is saying, and I obviously had not discussed it with him before, but he did agree that I understood what he was getting at. If you knew absolutely for certain that Mashiach is going to be here by next Tuesday, what would you do differently between now and then? So you would try to do things better. You would hold on by your fingernails on the edge of the windowsill, but you wouldn't let go. You would say, and maybe you would do better, but you're not going to be planning. You're not going to be thinking, what do things have to look like? You're just going to hold on. When you say 5 years, 10 years, you're not talking about the calendar. What you're talking about is the need to take life seriously, the need to make serious plans.
Right.
And, there's the idea that you're not mevatel tinekas shel beis rabban, even for binyan beis hamikdash. What does it mean? That chinuch of what we have to do has to always be in the here and now. How are we going further?
Right.
What are going to be the next steps? No one with the biggest imagination and the strongest connection to everything that is good and holy could have predicted that we would be sitting here 30 years later and that Lubavitch should be as beautiful as it is. The Mashiach did not yet It's mind-boggling. How did that happen? How did that happen? And so the question is not, there are a lot of problems that we can point to, and there are a lot of really big challenges, and there are a lot of things like what's going to be.
Right.
That's not the surprise. They were predicting much bigger challenges and much bigger problems, and nobody would have been surprised. But the idea of not seeing the Rebbe for 30 years, the question is, how is it possible that we look as good as we do?
I think it's fair what you're saying. I think it's fair to acknowledge that like you said, if you went back in time, would you expect to see today what you see today? No, the answer is no. Certainly people were not speaking that way. You don't even have to go back that far. I mean, I remember growing up being told all kinds of things. There's no way that Mashiach won't come after 10 years or 20 years. But I
think we all realize that a calendar for Mashiach coming, in my mind, we have one calendar for Mashiach coming, and that is today. That's the only thing to work with. But
right.
Other than that?
Well, essentially, it's old-fashioned. We're back to old-fashioned Judaism.
Why call it old-fashioned?
No, I'm saying in a good way. I'm saying the sense that
Rambam is okay. He's pretty current.
I'm saying, right,
Yeah.
But that was always how you looked at Mashiach, I think. I don't know if you could say that.
I'm sorry, I want to go off for a minute because a lot of times people, like there's two things that go together that we don't always put together. A lot of times people who, for some reason, having a skeptical or even cynical attitude is sometimes seen as being more realistic. I'm not sure why that is, but that's the world that we live in. That people would say, well, this is how Jews survived all of the terrible things that happened over the centuries. They had like this they could kind of like detach because believing in Mashiach, that's what carried them through.
Right. That's not what I meant by the
I
way.
know. And I don't mean to imply that you did, but I'm saying that you hear that kind of thing. And it
Right.
was kind of like almost like an escape from reality. The reality is so awful. And then there's like this escape and,
Right.
believe Mashiach. And that kind of like a bubble that you could kind of put yourself into. So it's like almost like an anesthetic to numb the pain of whatever's going on.
Right.
But you take a flip side of it. And the flip side of Jewish history is that there is no way to define Jewish history other than it is a miracle.
Right.
And when I say that in scientific terms, if you want to say, there is no parallel. There is no way that you can explain. There was the famous quote from one of the he was I believe an anti-Semite.
Mark Twain.
No, Mark Twain had nice things to say. No, Toynbee, who was not, he had no explanation for the Jews and he was not happy about it. He kind of like, he worked around that. But that makes sense. That makes sense. There is no, but if you put the two things together, that the realistic, and I'll call it realistic expectation of Mashiach is the miracle of Jewish existence. So it's not like another old idea that's carrying forward. That we defied history because we had this. What does it mean? It means that we expect the world to be a good place.
Right.
We expect, so when you expect that the real nature of the world is that it's a happy, healthy, emotionally healthy, spiritually healthy, mentally healthy, socially healthy. It's a happy and healthy world. That's the world that we envision. That means that the way I interact with the world is, I know what it's supposed to look like. I know two things. Number one, I am not here as a passive observer. I am not a spectator.
Right.
I'm not, well, when's it going to happen already? When's the show going to start?
But you have to admit that for many years in Lubavitch, there was a sense it has to be this year, it has to be next year, it has to be this day, it has to be that day. And so that's what I meant. That we've gone back to what you're talking about here.
So wait a second. When you say in Lubavitch, one of the things about Lubavitch is that there are many different ways of thinking, many different approaches.
But you just said yourself that the Bachrim after Gimel Tammuz were sure that Mashiach had to come by a certain time, and before Gimel Tammuz there was also talk like that. Was it every single Lubavitcher? No, I don't know. There's no way I can prove it.
Okay, I would say I would put that way of thinking into two categories. When the Rebbe made a designation for the year, that this should be, I think when Beis was the year, Bias Mashiach.
Right.
If the Rebbe made a designation for the year, you could write on that. After that, after the Rebbe, we don't have those designations. I don't personally understand how anybody could get caught up in anything other than now.
Right.
And what am I doing now? So say that Lubavitch thought, were there Lubavitchers who thought that way? Possibly, but
I'm agreeing with you. I'm agreeing with you that there was a time where, for legitimate reasons, Lubavitchers believed that Mashiach had to come this year or next year or by this time, by that time. There was that kind of sense, Mashiach.
So wait, I'm going to interrupt you.
Just said,
do you mean
year.
Mashiach coming today?
No, but when you say Toshim and Beis, you're talking about a year,
I'm saying
not
the Rebbe gave that designation.
So the Lubavitchers believed that, right?
Yeah.
There was that sense of that there was Mashiach would come by this time, and now what you're talking about is a more traditional within Lubavitch, but also within Yiddishkeit in general of a belief in Mashiach coming, today today. There's a belief that Mashiach can come at any moment, right? And will come at any moment, even though he tarries.
Okay.
Anyway. Why was I? This is not a hill that This is not
the hill that you want. I say live on.
This is not
the hill to live on.
This is not the hill that I live on. I'm trying to remember why I brought it up. I think it's very fair to say, like you were saying, that Lubavitch has exceeded expectations, but and I also point taken that very often in the comfort of and the comfort of that a generation may find itself in. Like, let's say Jews in America will look back with kind of condescension at the old-fashioned Jews in Russia or Poland who pined for the days of Mashiach and like, oh, such primitives. And it's like, let's see you survive a day in their shoes, right? And it's very easy to laugh at the kind of Bubba-mises, let's say, of yesteryear, when you don't have to deal with what they're dealing with. And point taken, like it's easy to come now and say, well, Lubavitch should have done things different, or people in Lubavitch should have done things different. No, it's easy. I'm critiquing that.
I'm not saying that.
No, I know.
Okay.
I know, but I'm accepting the critique that one should not say, well, this was wrong or this is a failure, when it's very easy to talk back, to look back in history and talk from the peanut gallery. My point is only that survival is not the same thing as being a pioneering generation. So I accept the idea of being a pioneering generation. I accept the idea. I accept the premise. I'm just saying that the fact that people are still around, or that Lubavitch is still around, does not in itself tell you that there's a sense of pioneering. Pioneering, at least the way I understand it by definition, is, but I think the most basic premise of being a pioneer is that there's a positive spirit to it. And there's a positive, there's a sense that there is a prize at the end of this adventure, right? That's the idea of being a pioneer, right? And I do not, at least growing up, I cannot speak to every nook and cranny in the world of Lubavitch, and I cannot speak to every development that's happening right now. But the world I grew up in was not one of positive acceptance of the time that we live in, and how lucky are we to be on this adventure as pioneers. It was way more like we are the stranded ones on an island, right, from a shipwreck. And our job is to survive until the ship comes back or some other ship comes to pick us back up, right? And so I accept very much the idea of being pioneers. I think that is the key, not just to survival, but to a flourishing, God willing, future. I accept that. I'm just saying that the fact that anyway, that was my point.
Okay, I think I need to clarify a couple of things. Obviously, nobody would say that whatever we're going to take out of this period of history, nobody can say that we would choose to be in a world in which we don't see the Rebbe. Nobody's that's the positive aspects would, and there are positive aspects of this generation, but that's definitely not one of them.
But why is that relevant?
It's absolutely relevant.
Why is it relevant whether or not we would choose to be in this time?
Oh, I thought you meant
No. Why is it relevant if we want to? Like, a pioneer doesn't do his adventure or go on his journey because that's what he would choose from all potential options. It's because that's what he has.
That's what he has to deal with. Well, except that there are elements of being a pioneer that do involve choice, because nobody's on an automatic track. And I want to look a little bit about what is the track that we're on now.
But sorry to.
It's okay. What?
I think a lot of times there's a sense of, yes, you're a pioneer, or we are pioneers, but let's also make sure to remember that we're reluctant to be here. Okay. I don't believe that works. That's my feeling. I don't believe that works. You cannot inspire a pioneering spirit when there's always a caveat.
Your point is well taken.
Yeah,
your point is well taken.
Does that mean? And I think where a lot of that comes from is a sense that anybody who feels inspired by their time today is coming at the cost of. So if you're enthusiastic about your life today, that means that you prefer this to Gimel Tammuz, or to before Gimel Tammuz. And it's like, no, that has nothing to do with anything.
Right.
This is a time I live in. I don't have control over time.
Right.
God has control over time. This is a time I live in. So I'm going to pioneer in my circumstance right now.
Fine.
Without any reluctance.
Fine.
That's
Yeah, no, that's good. That's good. Because I think implicit in the word pioneer is opportunity.
right.
And opportunity has to be a positive thing. Otherwise, it's
Right.
what's the opportunity?
Exactly.
So I want to come back to some of the where I was
Sure.
starting from with the beginning of it, and that is when I had mentioned earlier about what the Rebbe had said. You have to do the work, and what does that mean? And it doesn't just mean it's sometimes we see some of these things in very narrow circumstances. And the Rebbe's vision, I think, is so much broader. And over the years, maybe we get a little bit of a sense of just how broad that can be.
Huh.
But there was an expression that the Friedrich Rebbe said about his father, about the Rebbe Rashab. He said, the Tatut gekent übernehmen de Welt, oder übermachen de Welt, oder mit stecken, nor nicht gewollt, nor dafke mit chassidus. That he could have, my father could have like transformed the world with a stecken, which is kind of like a code word for meifsim, supernatural wonders. But he didn't want to. He wanted it to be with chassidus. The world has to be transformed.
Mm-hmm.
But not by supernatural miracles that God does or that tzaddikim do or that the Rebbeim do and so on, but it has to be with chassidus. In other words, the efforts of human beings. It's Torah, it's chassidus. We're not expected to invent that, but integrating the world with Torah, only human beings can do. And what the Rebbe guided us from the beginning was that we have to do that work, and we are going to have to make a lot. Now, we have a lot of framework to work within, and it's not like we're not chas v'shalom, never. I once asked the Rebbe for guidance at a difficult time in my life, and I had an answer that took me over 40 years to really get it. I'm still working with it, but for 40 years, I just, okay, it didn't. Al pi shulchan aruch, kel bitachon b'Hashem, v'simcha b'avedaseh. And according to Shulchan Aruch, which includes trusting in Hashem and joy in serving Him. And it took me many, many years to realize that Shulchan Aruch is the most liberating framework that can be. Because if I'm going to have to work it all out, do I want to be honest in the store or I don't want to be honest in business? Or do I want to lie to my friend or something, or I don't want all the things. And of course, Shabbos and Kashrus and so on. But if it's me figuring out what I want to do, I'm going to put all of my energy into that. I don't know where I'm going to end up. And it's just, the given is al pi shulchan aruch. And then now you have a lot of work to do. It doesn't solve your problems, but it gives you a canvas.
Right.
But what are you going to paint on it?
Right.
And that this idea of transforming the world, I think one of the things that I understood about my life growing up on shlichus, and certainly in my life on shlichus as an adult, the one to benefit the most from anything that I had to do ever was myself. That I had to come up with answers. I had to think about things. I couldn't answer somebody if they were asking me questions that I hadn't thought of.
Right.
So that's work. In the end, I benefited from having to do that work. And it happened, over and over and over again. But it was much more than that. The Rebbe gave us a way of looking at people. So that somebody walks through the door of the Chabad house with whatever, tattoos and safety pins in his ears or nose or whatever, and look at the neshama. There's a neshama here. There's a neshama here. The Rebbe guided us that, and we experienced it over and over again. So I think that over the years, like the challenges, and it's not just a Lubavitch challenge, it's a challenge in the frum world in general, the challenge of how we see that you alluded to before a little bit about the searching generation, or the generation, that some people feel that you're only really being authentic if you walk away,
Right.
which is, on the one hand, it's very condescending.
Right.
And I would like to separate that into two parts. That's how you look at yourself, how you look at the ones who are wandering, and how you look at the ones who stay.
Right.
So the first thing about the ones who stay, don't ever for a minute assume that they're just that way.
Right.
Some people
agree.
are deep thinkers and some people are not. So the authenticity, maybe you're not seeing the struggle,
Right.
and maybe it's not a struggle in the same, but that's as far as those who do wander. So I think that the Rebbe's chinuch for us of how we look at others, we take that and bring it right back into when it's in our own families.
Right.
And it's in our own communities. And how we, and then maybe what's the hardest piece of all is how we look at ourselves. We were taught how to be non-judgmental, how to be compassionate, how to give people the benefit of the doubt, how to see the person for the holy core that they have, and not see all the ways in which they present. So the Rebbe sent us out, and we can do that with the whole world, all, Klal Yisrael. And now we can do it with those that are closest to us.
Right.
And the biggest challenge, but can I do that for myself? Can I do that for myself? Can I learn to it doesn't mean justifying things that I'm doing that I shouldn't,
Right.
but can I learn to have compassion for my own struggles? So that young people or old people, whatever, people who are, they're expressing what's going on inside, and seeing that as something that has to be addressed with, authenticity.
Absolutely. Look, I think something I've been thinking about recently is that, there's a tragic misunderstanding sometimes that faith and compassion don't go together. Where because you're so, like, faith is like sometimes misconstrued or seen as like a very there's one way of believing, and so compassion is to see outside of that and to see a different way, and it's like, but the two are at odds, right? And in many ways, the deepest compassion comes from faith, because especially according to Chassidus, where there's godliness in everything, and God is far bigger than your conception of Him. So when you see the Rebbeim were able to look at this world, this very, very this very lowly world, and say, not only is this world worthwhile, or this world is also something. They said this world is it. This is what the Eibusha wanted. This very lowly world is precisely the deepest reflection of God Himself. That is a ultimate act of compassion. That's an ultimate act of compassion, and that comes from faith.
Passive.
No,
That's
of course not.
Passive,
Of course
because
not.
seeing the world as
Of course not.
the
Compassion.
ultimate doesn't mean accepting it, that this is how it's supposed to be.
Of course not. Well, that compassion is never passive. Compassion is not passive. To have the compassion, and it's not like, okay, therefore I'm okay with it. Compassion is not tolerance. Compassion is not, which in many ways, that kind of tolerance is just contempt and arrogance. Like, I don't mind that person, I'll be nice to that person. No, compassion is I care, and if I care, then if there's a place for me to make that person's life better, then I will do that too. Compassion is never passive or condescending. So yeah, so I absolutely accept and understand what you're saying. That I think in many ways, the challenge of today, is like you said, to have compassion for the situation we find ourselves in. And I think with compassion, we can look at it without, without regret, without remorse, without negativity, to find the godliness in this moment, to find the mission in this moment, to find the pioneering spirit in this moment. And I think as much as that will be accomplished, that is how much there is to hope for.
So, if you don't mind, I want to take it back to that unwritten, let alone unpublished
Okay,
essay.
go ahead.
That on October 7th, obviously we didn't know what was going on early in the morning. Somebody came into Chabad house an hour before any davening would start. And I have to pray, an Israeli, or he had lived in Israel for years. And okay, what? And he telling my husband what happened. And, over the course of the day, we were hearing more and more. And this fellow, he had gone out, he came back in, and I told him later that I was jealous of the Avas Yisrael that I saw on his face, that you could see that he was experiencing what he didn't just hear something and feel bad, but his whole face. And I was listening to him, and I had this, and I don't know, I was saying Esther, what's Esther? And I want to share a little bit, if you don't mind, about how I processed and an understanding that I came to, especially because you're using the term chaos and how much potential there is in chaos and how chaos is the place where the real stuff happens. So I remember as a kid having heard the medrash of that when the Yidden were by Har Sinai, Kaf Alehem Har Kegigis, that the Eibishter held the mountain over their heads and said, you take it, fine. If not, Peitei Kvuraschem. You're going to be buried here. Either you accept the Torah, you'll be buried here. Like, whoa, like what happened to Nasav and Ishma, like what, but then later hearing different explanations that sat well with me. One of them was that it wasn't that Hashem was saying literally that he would drop the mountain, but that rather that with Torah, you'll be eternal. Without, then you'll be like any other nation. Not that you would die on the spot. You'll come and go like every other nation comes and goes. That's a natural law of the history of civilization, rise and fall. Torah will make you eternal. Okay, then later I heard the explanation that I think the Alter Rebbe gives, that the Eibishter basically was like flooding them with love. In other words, it wasn't really a choice because it was so Hashem's love and care. They had just experienced Yitzias Mitzrayim and Kriyas Yamsuf, and here they are, and they're eating man, and they're by all of the miracles, and the love is so overwhelming that being love bombed that way, it wasn't really a choice. What else could they say? Well, there was that idea until, later in the times, Kimu v'kiblu haYehudim, that in the times of Mordechai and Esther, that it wasn't just a one moment, that maybe they got all nervous and so they said yes for a minute, but it was 11 months. And they had an out, 11 months where the Gezerah was on them, but they got together and they davened and they fasted, like Esther said. They got their act together as Jews and they lived that way, and they had an out. Hitler was worse than Haman. Haman was not, if somebody left Yiddishkeit, Haman was not out to get them. He was going for the Jews, and nobody did. Nobody did. And So 11 months they maintained that connection to the Eibishter. And that's what showed that here, where they weren't being love bombed, the Eibishter's name is not in the Megillah. It was not obvious. He was Haster Aster Panay Bayem Ha'u. That's Esther. That's that moment. And he's hidden, and we have Purim. Because the Yidden responded the way they had to respond. Mordechai, Esther guided them, showed them, but in the end, it was your everyday man, woman, child that stepped up into that chaos, into that horror. And it wasn't like they could go someplace else. And I think in many ways, looking at it now, not just in the larger lens of Jewish history, but looking at it as a Lubavitcher, that in the times, the Rebbe's message from the beginning, and it's even before he was a Rebbe, the Friedrich Rebbe asked him to make this book, this calendar for teachings for every day, and the Hayom Yom. And the opening question of the book that a person has to ask themselves every single day, and this was in the middle of the Shoah, while the fires of Europe were burning, what is the question? Not when is Mashiach coming? Not how much do I believe? What have I done and what am I doing to make this happen? So you never lose agency. You're not a victim. You're not being tossed around by the winds and the storms and all of that. And I think that it's possible to say, like my years in New York in school were the chufs. And all you had to do was show up.
Right.
And it was like when I think of the experience for me, the formative experience of all of my years there, I understood very little of what I heard. But I could not pull myself away. I didn't want to pull myself away. I just wanted to be there. Hakafis. And the feeling that I had during Hakafis, that anything is possible. Like everything of any vision, it's all that's what grabbed me as a teenager. And I'm obviously not the only one. So then what happens? So we have, it's almost like that was our Maimed Har Sinai. So we signed on, but it was almost like, how could you not? And those are like people sometimes refer to, the glory days. Lubavitch is taking over the world, and the Rebbe said this, and the Rebbe showed this, and it was so out there, and you could see it, and it was. There was Bachman from a Litvish yeshiva who were with us and talking about how this one went to Lubavitch, that one went to Lubavitch, and somebody said, like, you never hear stories in the other direction. How come? He said, because in Lubavitch there's a buzz, there's always an excitement. You never know what's going to happen, and it was like that. It was almost like it drew you in. Not chas v'shalom, some kind of an emotional. It was the intellectual satisfaction was very deep and very broad and engaged the greatest minds, and you were part of that. And then what happens? So the pioneering generation is to forge a connection to the Rebbe, which, as always, has to be personal. It's personal. It's one-on-one, each person. How wide do you want to hold your basket? You want to hold your basket, the Rebbe's brachas. You want to hold your basket a little broader. The Rebbe's giving, how broad, how big is your basket? Or is your connection going to be something other than the Rebbe's going to give and I'm going to take? And what am I going to do? What am I going to give? When you say chaos, there are millions of opportunities. There's nothing that's compelling. And it's not like there's a social stigma, even within Lubavitch, if somebody doesn't sign on in that way. It's a purely personal thing. And the fact that it's hard only makes it that more real. So I feel like that's the thread all the way through, and the Rebbe's, on the one hand, you could say the challenge to us to ask ourselves, like in Hayom Yom, what have I done? What am I doing? Or in the way that the Rebbe said, you have to do it yourself. And at the same time, the many, many, many ways in which it's possible for a person to feel that connection. And I would not give up a minute of the connection that I was able to see and hear with my own eyes and ears. And yet, when I look at my grandchildren and I see the quality of their connection, I can be jealous. Because they don't have any externals to hang it on. They have to go straight for pneumias. We had so much gorgeous chitzenias, beautiful. But in a certain way, spiritually, it was externals. Nowadays, it's straight for the core.
On that note, thank you very much. This has been a pleasure. And I'm sure there's a lot more to talk about, but the day is no longer so young.
The day is not young. No,
And
this is true.
thank you very much. Very much appreciated.
Thank you for the opportunity. Thank
Very
you for the
welcome.
opportunity.
You're very welcome. The music for this podcast comes from the album Repentant Doors by Oren Sor and Nadav Vachar and is used with their permission.